Afternoon, everyone, from one side of the building to another. I'm Bridget Noonan. I'm the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly in Victoria, and it was funny watching my colleague Andrew on the screen when he's really just down that corridor. I'm joining you from my office in Melbourne, which of course is on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and I pay my respects to the First Nations people of this land and First Nations people of lands that are participating in this virtual conference. Well, what an amazing couple of days of discussion we've just had. I don't know about you, but I sat on the train on my way home last night with my brain just itching or scratching around with all these amazing ideas that I want to try out. I think as a practitioner of parliamentary procedure, I perhaps fall into the habit of assuming that my environment or the characteristics of the procedures here are more universal than they really are, which is why occasions such as the ASPG conference are such a fantastic opportunity for us to learn about each other's experiences and perhaps test some of the assumptions about our own jurisdictions and the way that we do things. So congratulations to all of the conference organisers and presenters on feeding up such a hearty diet of discussion for us this week. Gosh, I've mixed metaphors, haven't I? I'm terribly sorry. It's probably only worse to come. Session 8 is really the nuts and bolts of parliamentary procedure, and we are in for an absolute treat. We have one presentation about a really sticky statutory secrecy case study, which I think most clerks would be very happy not to have to experience. So we're going to learn about how that played out. And another paper about some real reform in a jurisdiction and an evaluation of that, which I think is so super valuable, because what we don't often do is as practitioners is take the time to stop and evaluate whether the changes we or the chambers have been making have hit the mark and been worthwhile. But I feel like I'm getting into the question session before we've had the presentation. So you're all quite familiar with how these go. I will introduce our presenters in turn now and then ask them to present in turn. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So we have got two fantastic presenters with us today. One of them, I think, going well and truly above and beyond the call of duty given time zones. Jonathon, I do not know what time it is where you are, but I can only imagine it's unpleasant. So well done you for participating today. So juggling my pieces of paper here, Jonathon King is took up the post of Clerk of the Tynwald in September 2021. As Clerk, Jonathon has responsibility for delivering all parliamentary services, including procedural advice and drafting, committee secretariat functions, reporting and information management, including audio streaming, Hansard and library functions, ceremonies and events, and engagement and outreach, both international and domestic. Jonathon served as Deputy Clerk of the Tynwald and Clerk of the Legislative Council from 2007 to 2021, Clerk of the Public Accounts Committee from 2007 to 16, Clerk of the Social Affairs Policy Review Committee from 2011 to 21, Clerk of the Economic Policy Review Committee 2016 to date, and Clerk of the Emoluments Committee from 2008 to 2021. He has managed committee inquiries on a wide range of social, economic, environmental, legal and financial issues. Honestly, Jonathon, that's just greedy taking on all of that subject matter. Jonathon has delivered training in parliamentary law and practice to the Isle of Man civil servants and trainee Manx advocates, and in parliamentary history through the University College Isle of Man. He's an active participant in interparliamentary networks, including the UK and Irish Parliamentary and Assembly Procedural Officials Network and the CPA, with whom he has delivered knowledge sharing and capacity building programs in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. Jonathon was a UK civil servant from 1998 to 2007, and before that, talk about a change in career, Jonathon, was a historical musicologist. After Jonathon presents, we are going to be really lucky to hear from Allison Stowe. Allison has worked at the New South Wales Parliament since 2008. She's had a number of roles during this time, including in the Legislative Council procedure, Legislative Council committees, and members' entitlements, always a straightforward, never very vexed issue. She is currently a Principal Counsel Officer Procedure. Allison has a Bachelor of Arts in History, Politics and International Relations and a Master of Public Policy and Governance, both from the University of New South Wales. Allison has an interest in quantitative and statistical research, which certainly comes through in your paper, I have to say, Allison, and how such analysis may develop an understanding of the operation and impact of Parliament. So that's quite enough from me. I'll now hand over to Jonathon to take us through his presentation. I have to say, Jonathon, I read your paper with my hands over my eyes at times, thinking I was very glad not to be you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Can you hear me all right? Great. And I am indeed very pleased to be here. It is 5:05 in the morning in the Isle of Man. So thank you for acknowledging that. It's a great treat to meet you and to be able to meet some members of this group, albeit in a very brief and virtual way. I would have loved, when I read your conference program, I would have loved to have attended more of your sessions because you have a fascinating agenda over the week. And I can only plead that while you've been talking about all these fascinating matters, I have in fact been asleep. I congratulate you on a fascinating conference. I look forward to the day when I'll be able to meet you in person. And I bring you greetings from Tynwald, the world's oldest parliament in continuous operation, and also from the Study of Parliament group based around Westminster, of which I have been a member for some years. Now, Thursday afternoon, I recognize it can be a time of gentle nodding off, particularly at a physical conference. If you've had a good conference lunch, maybe that's not the case today. And I hope that in the next few minutes, I'll give you something that will keep at least some of you awake. And as Bridget says, for the clerks around the table, this story is one which we may not choose to embark on. But as it happens, about a year ago, in the Isle of Man, we were at we thought we were in the middle of an adventure in data protection and parliamentary privilege. I'd like to say, touching wood, that actually it was about to end. And so I'll come to the end later. But as I said in my paper, on the 9th of March 2021, so about a year ago, we had a very rare example of a debate in Tynwald about us, or at least about parliamentary privilege and about the balance between the parliamentary authorities and the citizens in general. And so when I saw your call for papers back in June, I thought this might be of interest to you. It was certainly related to parliamentary transparency, checks and balances. Incidentally, as I think I said in my paper, we had a conference of this among our own procedural officials network within the British Islands back in March as well. And so the paper is largely the same. And I'm sorry if it's a bit elliptical at times, but as it mentions in passing, there are live court proceedings in the background to all this. So I'm not able to tell all of the stories in the full detail in which I will be able to one day. So it was a story which touched on many issues, from the Isle of Man's relationship with the UK and Europe to this the lessons that you learn when people make legislation about you. Even if you're the legislature, you can be tripped up. And yet at the core, it's a story about the experience of vulnerable people in our community and how parliamentarians can help them. So what am I talking about? Let me give you a few pictures to help us along the way, if I can do this. I'm going to try and share my screen. Here I am sitting in the Isle of Man, and I don't know how familiar you are with the Isle of Man, but we are a small jurisdiction, population of 84,000, and a small parliament with 35 members. Now, I draw out those two figures because in a parliament of 35 members and 84,000 people, it won't take the world's greatest mathematician to work out there's quite a small number of voters per member. And so there is a very lively connection between the members of the legislature and the community. It's sometimes stated of small jurisdictions that everyone knows everyone else. That's not really true. Even in an island like this, yes, you do meet the same people a lot of the time, but everyone doesn't know everyone else. And crucially, everyone doesn't know everything about everyone else. And in terms of the culture of our community, there is an acute sensitivity to who knows what and who gets to know what when. And if you go around the Isle of Man Parliament and government buildings, which I've got a picture of later, they look like on the outside it must be very easy and everything must be very intimate and like a family. But you know, even in families, teenagers will close their doors and lock them to their parents, and it's very like that. There are a lot of locked doors. So members of Tynwald are constantly juggling with lots of information which people tell them, but they don't want them to tell anyone else. On this slide, I've written the words, why Tynwald has so much personal data. And just a couple of minutes on this. So in an island where people are very jealous of their privacy, nevertheless, things go wrong, and like every other jurisdiction, we have to have mechanisms to do something about it. This is an image of petitioners approaching Tynwald Hill. And when you come to the Isle of Man, which I hope you all will, try to come on the 5th of July, old midsummer day, and see our ancient parliamentary ceremony, which we think has been going on for more than 1,000 years. It's certainly been going on for more than 600 years because we have documents to prove that. And an integral part of the ceremony is petitioners coming up to the hill to present their grievances. Now, these petitions go into a process, so it's a ceremony, but it's also a real parliamentary process. And not all petitions get picked up, but some do. And if they do get picked up, they can become the subject of committee proceedings, and the petitioner will be invited to come in and tell their story. Now, they sometimes use this to promote a political campaign, and they want as much publicity as possible. But we have also a strand of committee work and petition-based committee work, which is very private. And so, for example, over the last 10 years, I have clerked a committee on legal aid in family matters, where people were complaining about the way family courts worked. In fact, another one on family courts, which was euphemistically entitled The Care and Upbringing of Children, but it wasn't about that. It was about the delays in the family court in matrimonial proceedings, and how dreadful it is for the families when they're two parents of the same child are going through a battle with one another. We've also had committee inquiries on things which are not derived from petitions, but in this culture that we have where members are very close, well, all members are close to the community, but the point is they can bring that community focus right up into the Parliament itself, both in the plenary and in the committees. So we've done committees where committee will actually go out to the public with a press release and say, we are interested in what it's like when social services come around to your house. Please come and tell us your story, and we will not tell anyone else what happened in your case, but we will use this as a way of deriving questions which we will then put to the public authorities in charge of, for example, family social services. We've also incidentally done these private inquiries based on private evidence on the economic side. What's it like applying for a government grant in the Isle of Man? Same sort of sensitivity. People will come along, they will tell you their story, and they will say, it was terrible applying for a grant. I can't believe this happened, that happened. The person on the phone said this, that, and the other. But please don't tell anyone I said that. And that's the key. It's the please don't tell anyone I said that, which we wrestle with when we get into the privacy legislation. Now, I'll let you read this slide for a second. I stress that this is a fictitious example, but I have put this slide up just as a way of making it very real, not to teach anyone to suck eggs, but just to ask you to put yourselves in the position of the clerk of committee. So imagine that you've done a inquiry of the kind I've described, and at least 2 witnesses have come to talk to your committee in private. And witness A has said to you that they had a terrible experience, doesn't matter what it was, but it was in dealing with some public service, presumably, which you were scrutinizing. And A had a terrible experience. B, C, and D were there too. We never talk about it. So A, B, C, and D, we learn never talk about this. It was so bad. And then witness B comes in and says, I don't want anyone to know that I've talked to you. I had this terrible experience. A, B, sorry, that should be A, C, and D were there too. A, C, and D were there too. A was wearing that red baseball cap he always wears. So there you have 2 pieces of evidence. Neither of those pieces of evidence in itself is going to help you fix the world, but it's all part of the story of Island life, which is a scrutiny committee you are interested to know, and indeed entitled to know, I would argue. Time marches on. You may do a report, you may not, probably you do. And you don't mention A, B, and C, and D in your report, or the experiences, or the red baseball cap, but you do scrutinize the public services that they were dealing with, and you've done your job. And in comes an email which is from A some while later and says, please supply me with all the personal data which you hold about me. Now, you can send back to A the transcription of what A said to the committee, because that's known to A, and it's not going to cause anyone any embarrassment. But then you have this piece of information on the right-hand side about A, which is derived from B, and you know that A has a red baseball cap. That's personal information about A. He's probably entitled to it, but you've got it from B, and B doesn't want you to know. We know that B and A don't talk to each other about this, and B doesn't want you to know, doesn't want anyone to know that B has been into the committee. I give that just as an illustration of the kind of wrestling that we have to do. Clearly, this is not unique to Parliament. So lots of public services collect information from individuals in private, whether you're the police or indeed social services themselves, or the people giving out grants. You have to deal with personal information. But I think where we are is that the law in Europe has been developing in this area for about the last 30 years. And most people who work in most public services get taught this stuff as soon as they arrive. There is a balancing act that has to go on with this kind of stuff. This is an example of third-party data, and you have to go through a series of procedures. You may have to check with B. Do they mind if they pass that information to A? Or you may make a judgment that it shouldn't go to A, but then you will be scrutinized by, in the Isle of Man and in the UK similarly, the Information Commissioner. And I'm assuming, or at least, yeah, I'm assuming that it's the same in your jurisdictions, although I confess that I haven't checked. Okay, so that's the kind of issues we're dealing with. What happened on our particular adventure in the Isle of Man is that in September 2020, we had our first requests for what's called in the jargon in Europe a data subject access request. So a person writing in fact, we had 2 people on the same day, which is really weird because we've had this law for 20 years here and no one has ever sought to exercise their rights. And 2 of them did on the same day in September 2020. I've never understood that, and I don't suppose I ever will, but they did. We consulted our friends in Westminster, which is what we tend to do in the Isle of Man, because we're quite similar to Westminster structurally, constitutionally. And they said, well, we would apply privilege. So we thought, well, we'll apply privilege. And we thought we'll be hyper transparent about this. We got the president of Tynwald, which is our presiding officer, to announce in a sitting that, look out, everybody, if you start sending us data subject access requests, we're going to apply privilege. This sent the Information Commissioner wild. I mean, the Information Commissioner has a very important job to do on behalf of the citizen, and I'm probably not the only public servant who deals with individuals who isn't always delighted to hear from the Information Commissioner. But fair play to the Information Commissioner, they pointed out that this was not really the right way to go about it, and under the laws applies to all public services, including us. You cannot have a blanket policy of not telling people stuff. You have to check case by case and line by line. So that was the first learning point. Fair enough. The next thing we thought, well, we'll check it case by case, line by line, and then we'll apply parliamentary privilege. And how did that go? Well, it went okay, except we discovered that our parliamentary privilege legislation, which had been on the statute book for, well, as I say, it'd been evolving for in Europe for 30 years. It had applied to us for 20 years, and it had been just supercharged about 3 years previously, following the latest wave of European law. So we discovered that it didn't say what we said it did. The first problem, well, the first problem, as I say, was the one about going through line by line. And the second, the really big problem, was that as drafted, it allowed for the Information Commissioner to supervise our application of parliamentary privilege. So we could try applying parliamentary privilege in a case like the one on the screen, but we had to allow for the fact that our thinking would, we would have to show all our working to the Information Commissioner, and the Information Commissioner could substitute his judgment for ours on whether we tell, for example, what we learned about A from B. That was the problem that we had. It was a problem in terms of parliamentary theory, the theory of parliamentary privilege being that under the doctrine of exclusive cognizance, as I'm sure you're all very well aware, we don't normally expect other people, whether they're courts or Information Commissioners, to come in over the threshold, as it were, look over our shoulder and check up on what we're doing with information which is internal to the procedures of Parliament, which we would say this was. So it was an offence, or at least an affront, if you like, to the doctrine of exclusive cognizance. And I think for me, equally important, and maybe even more important, we could talk about that. This was a real thing. There were real people in this story who had said things to us in confidence. We had given them promises that nobody else would know about it. And the Information Commissioner is somebody else. Okay, now you might say the Information Commissioner is a professional public servant, which of course he and his team are. But on the other hand, a promise is a promise, and we didn't believe that we should breach that promise if we could possibly avoid it. So what do you do when you're the legislature and you're stuck? Well, you know, of course, one of the things you can do is legislate. Governments can do that too. We did, and I've shown a picture here of one of the three chambers of our legislature, just to vary the image on the screen for a bit. And the legislation, which I mentioned before, was passed on the 9th of March. A very short debate, but nevertheless a nail-biting moment for those of us who had a stake in this project. I've set out in my paper some of the detail of what this legislation did. It borrowed from the UK and Jersey, and the fundamental point which it put in statute is that the Information Commissioner is not entitled to supervise our application of parliamentary privilege, and we have to do that for ourselves now, and that's how it should be in order to help us that enables us to keep those promises which I mentioned, and it appeals to it acknowledges the doctrine of exclusive cognizance. Now, of course, parliamentary authorities can get things wrong, so please be reassured there are still checks and balances in the system, And if we assert parliamentary privilege in a way which is irrational or abusive, we can be found out, because there is always the possibility of taking of challenging our decisions through the High Court. But somehow we don't feel that that is quite such an affront to exclusive cognizance, because after all, in all your jurisdictions and throughout the Commonwealth, the boundaries have got to be policed, have got to be negotiated somehow between the role of the Parliament and the role of the courts. So that's okay. We're not saying that the parliamentary authorities are infallible, but we are saying that we're a bit different. And when it comes to personal data, we have asserted through this legislation the right to continue to do our own thing. I mentioned a little bit about Europe a few times. I'm going to close very shortly, Bridget, thank you very much. But just to mention that one of the concerns that we addressed in developing this legislation was whether it would put us out of kilter with the requirements of the European Union. This is post-Brexit, so in theory you might say, why are we bothered about the European Union? But the answer is, of course, that we still trade with the European Union, and you could say the same as the United Kingdom. European Union law still matters a lot because we want to be able to trade with them, and they will still look at our law. We just have no say in what that law is. So that's Brexit. Where are we now? Well, later today, I'll be in this very beautiful building. This is an image of the outside of our Parliament building, which I thought I would show you as I have the chance. And I was looking through the photographs in the office yesterday, and I thought, well, this is quite a nice picture for today's purposes, because it's got this no entry sign in the middle. And actually, next to this in my file, there was another version of the picture when which somebody had removed the no entry sign to make a better photograph. But it's quite good to leave it in for today, because there you are. You can see nearly everything of the Parliament in this image, but there is this no entry sign. There is this little block, and you can't see what's behind this bit. And that's pretty much where we are. We are a very transparent outfit in Tynwald. Almost everything we do is in public. Almost everything we do is pushed out to the world as much as we can do it. And as was mentioned in my office earlier, we put a lot of effort into engagement and all that, but not everything. And we do have private business, and we are able to operate in private where it is necessary. And the no entry sign applies to Mr. A and Ms. B, and it applies to the journalists, and it applies to the Information Commissioner. I hesitate to say that we have any happy endings in this topic, because when I think of the individuals who've come in and told their stories to these committees, they don't have happy endings. They have many things. They've suffered much and continue to suffer. But Tynwald is there to try to govern the island with a small g, is there to do its best, is there to legislate and deliberate, and that's what it does. And I think we have got a better balance now than we had a year and a half ago between the rights of individuals and the privileges of the legislature to know as much as it possibly can about what's going on so that it can fulfill its functions. That's where we are. That's our adventure with data protection and parliamentary privilege. I would love to answer any questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing Allison's contribution. And otherwise, I am very glad to be here. Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Jonathon. And I must apologise for my Australian mangling the pronunciation of your jurisdiction at the outset. My deputy clerk insisted before I logged on that it was pronounced Tynwald, and I ignored him, and let that be a cursory lesson to all clerks on the screen, what happens when you ignore your deputy. It's a trap best avoided. Might hold questions over until the end so that you and Allison can answer them as a panel. So perhaps now I will call on Allison to present her findings on the evaluation of the changes made in her jurisdiction. Over to you.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everyone. I'm presenting from the New South Wales Parliament today. I'm in one of the meeting rooms. Our Parliament rests on Gadigal land, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to the First Nations people of our state. As Bridget said, today I'm presenting on the procedural changes from the current session of the New South Wales Legislative Council, so the upper house here in New South Wales, and it's what my paper calls the shake-up. Following the 2019 state election, the non-government majority in the New South Wales Legislative Council expanded and diversified. And while the decade to 2018 had seen some of the most rapid evolution of the council's role, this shift in the composition of the House became the impetus for significant procedural change. And since 2019, the House has adopted a suite of new rules known as sessional orders in order to achieve wide-ranging procedural reform. And so I have this quote from Adam Searle, one of the key members behind the push for procedural reform, and it describes the procedural change undertaken this Parliament as breathing new life into the processes and mechanisms of this place, through which we fulfil our function as a House of Review and hold the executive to account. And this goes to the three objectives or goals that really drove the procedural change, and members sought to enhance the capacity of the House to scrutinise the executive, provide more opportunities for private members to raise matters of concern or interest, and create efficiencies in the operation of the House. And the three members on the slide, so Mr. Adam Searle, Leader of the Opposition, the ALP at the time, Mr. David Shoebridge from the Greens, and Mr. Robert Borzak from the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. They really drove the work required to realise these objectives and garner support for substantial changes to the rules of the House. And so I'll leave it to the members to discuss the May 2019 procedural reform themselves, and I sincerely hope that this works technically for everyone. It's not working at all. Of course it's not. So essentially I had some footage from the chamber which members went through each of those objectives and what they sought to achieve in relation to those objectives that they had for procedural reform. There was quotes from members in relation to working across the chamber. It was really commented on in May 2019 that there was goodwill across all parties. And the Leader of the government at the time spoke in May 2019 of the collaborative approach that the government took in supporting procedural change and the new sessional orders when they came before the House. And so in the current Parliament to December 2021, the House has adopted 58 sessional orders, and this slide shows the breakdown of the current sessional orders in a way that seeks to demonstrate how new they are. So 41 sessional orders were adopted in May 2019. 25 were based on past practice, and they kind of carried over in some way from a previous Parliament. And I note that in 2018, there was certainly a view that the House had undertaken a considerable amount of procedural reform in the preceding decade. And it had developed into an assertive House of Review, but that really didn't preempt what was to come in this Parliament. So in May 2019, 18 of the sessional orders from those 25 were largely readopting past reforms. 7 past reforms were reviewed and readopted with variations. The remaining 16 of those 41 sessional orders from May 2019 are for completely new practices. And the reform continued. And so since May 2019, 17 new sessional orders have been adopted to December 2021, 10 for additional new practices, and 7 are necessitated by the pandemic. In total, about 2/3 of our current sessional orders are for new or varied practices. And so what's new? Key reforms relate to questions, committees, parliamentary secretaries, private members' business, and the schedule or conduct of business. And these include increased opportunities to ask questions, with written questions now permitted each business day. There's reduced timeframes for the submission of answers, and there's new mechanisms to scrutinise those answers. There's greater alignment between the work and powers of the House and its committees, with a framework for committees to order state papers. So many people would have heard about Standing Order 52 and calling for state papers by the House. Standing Order 208 is the equivalent provision for committees. There's new rules for government responses, and there's a selection of bills committee which recommends which bills should be the subject of a parliamentary inquiry. The role of parliamentary secretaries was reconsidered, and their participation of private members is now restricted by sessional order, and there's new provisions for direct scrutiny of parliamentary secretaries. The framework for consideration of private members' business has been restructured, and the sitting week has been rescheduled to move our private members' day to Wednesday in the middle of the week to allow for a full day of business. There's also been the introduction of short form or 30-minute debates, which seeks to balance opportunities for debate with the orderly conduct of business. The House has limited its ability to sit past midnight by sessional order. And finally, in relation to the schedule of business, new mechanisms have been provided for the progression of business outside the formal sitting hours of the House. And so this includes delegating authority over specific matters to a committee or to the President. So how did this impact the work of the House? The most noticeable impact has been the increased volume of work that the paper provides, the increased volume of work that the House has the capacity to undertake. The paper provides comparative statistics across each of the categories that are noted here. And in a very vain attempt to do another video, I have included the year in review stats from 2020, and I do hope that this works. This was the first year of COVID, and so we all had to pivot. The House had to rethink almost everything about its conduct, and yet it was also a year where the impact of the rules and the new sessional orders in relation to the scope and scale of the work possible really became apparent. Members were using all mechanisms available to pursue business and to fill their roles as members and the functions of the House. So in digesting these quick stats, my key comment is pretty much everything was more, substantially more in many instances, or also the first since. So we were using procedures for the first time in a long time. So I am hoping that this video works for the statistical review of 2020. And I don't know that that is working either. Sorry for the tech problems, Rachel. So effectively in 2020, one of the key stats that we talk about is the increase in questions, because we can ask questions every day. In my paper, there's a graph that really shows that there were members really took advantage of being able to submit a question every day. And I think in 2020, there was over 1,600 questions. One of the other stats that we often discuss is the number of orders for papers. And in 2020 alone, we did 114 orders for papers. And in previous parliaments, we'd done a handful of papers across a handful of orders, across the entire Parliament. And members from the council often talk about the wing in the administrative offices that hold all of the returns and all of the boxes that we now have. In addition to those items of business where we saw a significant growth, we also did quite a range of procedures in relation to motions of censure, calling the leader of the government to attend its place to explain. There was also issues around parliamentary privilege that were dealt with, matters of privilege by the House. The House dealt with matters of public importance. We deal with them routinely now, whereas in the past that wasn't the case. And so aside from the sheer volume of work now possible, there were other impacts which the paper discusses through the themes of scrutiny, private members' business, and the conduct of business. So in relation to questions, being able to ask questions every day, and also the reduced timeframes for responses has really improved the timeliness of information available to members. However, the quality of information has been questioned by members, and it was discussed on the floor of the House via motion about trying to deal with this issue, that members would like better information, essentially, in response to their questions. The Selection of Bills Committee has certainly increased the scrutiny of bills by committees and the inquiries that are taken about legislation before the House. And members have really used in a new and significant way the processes available in the House and committee concurrently in order to pursue issues that they would like to raise or examine. The powers of committees under Standing Order 208 have been contested, and my paper talks through the detail of we're yet to receive a return in relation to Standing Order 208, and instead members are pursuing orders for papers using Standing Order 52 in the House. For private members' business, there's new opportunities for members to make statements in the House about matters of concern or matters of interest that they'd like to raise, and there's been about 380 opportunities in this Parliament for members to make those statements. In addition to that new opportunity, the way in which private members' day is conducted has changed. And so the whips list, what we call it, which would be a business committee, I think, in many other jurisdictions, members meet and agree with which items of private members' business will get precedence on the next day. And so that kind of pre-arranged agreement about what business will occur and in the order in which it will occur, in conjunction with a full day of private members' business and those short debates that I mentioned earlier, really has resulted in more debate, more orders for papers, more private members' bills being considered. We do note that shorter debate times often there's a constraint, I suppose, within a 30-minute debate compared to a 2-hour debate in relation to how much can be said, and members have been using leave in order to seek additional time if the shorter debate times don't allow them to put all of their contribution on the record. I also note as a trend that community-focused motions are generally still considered without debate. In relation to the conduct of business, the House has introduced a hard adjournment, or the midnight adjournment as we call it. It was intended to limit the amount the House sat, but ironically, it's kind of become the default adjournment for the House in most instances. And now we have a longer average sitting day than we have in the past. The other shift in relation to conduct of business is about when business is conducted or organised on non-sitting days, which we did do a little bit of in the past, but not at the scale and with the acceptability that we've got now. So the Selection of Bills Committee process and that whips list process, they both happen outside of the official House, during sitting days, but not when the House is sitting. Written questions, again, every day. And in relation to orders for papers, the President and members have a delegated authority to negotiate with the government about variations to the scope of orders for papers. And the Privileges Committee is able to meet to decide on disputes over claims of privilege on certain documents that are returned. And I will attempt to do my third video, which contains some commentary from two members in relation to the sessional orders and some reflection on how they've operated and the value that members have. On the whole, the sessional orders have been seen as a real true achievement this Parliament. They've achieved members' objectives and they've allowed the House to progress an extraordinarily busy and complex agenda. They've also enhanced the existing standing orders and procedures, further developed the way in which the House exercises its powers and traditions, and has sought to uphold the principles of parliamentary law and practice. So fingers crossed the last one works. Which again, I'm sorry it doesn't. And so the first member speaking was the Honourable Don Harlan, who was the then leader of the government, and he was talking in November 2009 about the way in which members had used the general election, that period, the non-sitting period around the general election, to really undertake procedural reform, and that he had thought it had done a significant amount of good things for the House, essentially. And I do have a quote in my paper, which, sorry, forgive me. He said that this year we've considered how we can do our job as a House of Review better. Many of the things that we have started doing have made our chamber more able to do its job for the people of New South Wales. I hope most members have that view. He goes on to say that, I will not say that everything we have done has been in that category, but that he hoped to return to that subject on another occasion. The other member that I'd hoped to show you footage of was David Shoebridge, the Greens member who really was driving procedural reform during 2019. And in his valedictory speech, he reflected on the way in which there was goodwill across the chamber in a number of ways, and that in his view, the procedural reform that has happened in New South Wales has changed the way that politics plays out in the council, and he sees that as a good thing for the House and for the people of New South Wales. And so this overall positive view of the procedural reforms has resulted in exploring the ongoing application of the sessional orders. And so to this end, in June 2021, the House referred the standing and sessional orders to the Procedure Committee for inquiry. In March 2022, so incredibly recently, the committee reported and they proposed that they have proposed revised standing orders for consideration by the House. They've recommended that they be trialled from May, subject to final review, and then adopted in November 2022. And so should this occur, this Parliament has indeed introduced the single most wide-ranging reform of the rules of the House since the 1895 standing orders were adopted. And I think I'll hand back to Bridget.
Thanks so much, Allison. And please don't worry about your videos not showing. I think you gave us in your presentation a really good sense of the colour and movement in your chamber. So don't worry at all about the lack of videos. I don't think there's an online meeting where some of the technology doesn't let us down. So don't worry about it all. Now it's time to open up to questions from the floor / screen, and I'm just looking for a show of hands or anything in the Q&A chat about questions. And perhaps while people are collecting their thoughts, I might kick off with a couple. First one to you, Jonathon, so Allison, you can catch your breath. Jonathon, we're in a slightly different situation in my jurisdiction in that our data privacy and protection laws don't apply to the proceedings in Parliament, so committee situations. But was wise, and I've always just thought that I've taken that for granted and thought that was just an inherently wise thing. But I've been reading your draft internal guidance note and wondering, and at the risk of asking a clerk what they actually think about something, I'm wondering if there is an argument that those provisions should extend to proceedings in Parliament with perhaps the safeguards that you've set out in your guidance note, or is that too explicit in asking you for an opinion?
Well, I think it is certainly a question of opinion, and I don't think we're that far apart, because if you read the UK and the Isle of Man legislation, it does say that in one place these provisions apply to Parliament or to Tynwald, but then in another breath it says, but it doesn't apply to information where processing of the information or giving it to the Commission or whatever it is would interfere with or infringe the privileges of Parliament. So there is always that kind of backdrop, and really it was in the fine detail of how that plays out that we had our adventure. I think as a citizen, I'm very happy to be living in an island where the law applies to everyone. That's a really good principle. And I think, you know, where the Parliament is dealing with, where the parliamentary authorities are dealing with things which aren't really parliamentary, like paying your staff or, you know, this kind of stuff, then clearly those members of staff are entitled to the same rights as if they had any other employer. The really tricky bit is, where do you draw the line between something like paying staff, which is clearly not a proceeding in Parliament, and preparing for a debate, which clearly is a proceeding in Parliament.
Yes, I think, thank you. That helps shape my thinking a bit. I feel sometimes members of the public here are surprised to discover that the law doesn't apply in quite the same way that they're used to engaging with government agencies. And I wonder if we need to be on the front foot a little bit more about modelling something that.
Well, that is very tricky, isn't it? Because it's the same here. People don't really realise this, and members don't really realise this. And then when you explain it to members, they say, "Oh, but that's terrible. You know, everyone's freedom should be equal, and you know, why are you giving me this privilege?" It's a bit like members' pay. I feel like I'm being paid too much, and politically, I feel vulnerable then, because I'm apparently taking, in a way, the word privilege itself is an unhelpful word, because what we really mean is that Parliament is different because it has a different role. Why does it have a different role? Because it's there to legislate for everybody else. And so Parliament, and the topic we're talking about, for example, needs to be able to know everything. It needs to be able to know as much as it can about what's going on.
Indeed. So that's given me some food for thought. That's for sure. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but on a purely selfish note, I just wanted to quickly ask Allison. I find sometimes that the institutional memory of members isn't great. They tend to come into the Parliament and assume that sometimes they think that everything they're faced with has been handed down from, you know, the Magna Carta, and I'm sitting there saying, no, that rule's only been around 5 years, and yes, I agree, it's a bit rubbish, don't worry, you can throw it out. Did you have a lot of new members in your new Legislative Council at the start of the Parliament? I guess, did they all know what they were voting for? And the flip side of that question is, do you foresee further reform at the start of your new Parliament once those new members are old members and have come to grips with how the chamber works?
I think the members that were involved at the time really weren't they weren't new members. They really had a depth of knowledge in relation to parliamentary procedure, and I think that came through in I suppose all parliaments have, like, you know, a historical trajectory of where their standing and sessional orders go, and this really was, like, it did feel like a transformative step forward in that same kind of trajectory. So the themes were the same. It wasn't new members taking us off on a new path. It was really members who had a depth of knowledge about parliamentary procedure that could really inform where we could go. And during the debate, members referenced, ideas that they'd taken from other jurisdictions or where we'd adopted practice of the Senate, for example. And the leader of the government is a former president, or the leader of the government at the time was a former president and an opposition whip before that. And so the crossbench and opposition members were really focused on that reform, but equally from the government side, the person taking carriage on that side really used that. And I think that's evidenced by there hasn't really been that many tweaks or changes to the sessional orders. In the large part, they were adopted by the House. And there's only been very few changes to a very small number of sessional orders. So I kind of don't expect a lot of new changes. I think that's what the next 6 months will be about for the House, and how they review the new suite of standing orders that has been recommended by the Procedure Committee and what they do prior to their adoption in November.
Sure, thank you. We'll watch that, that review with interest. Colleen's put a couple of really great questions in the chat that I'll read out for you both. Jonathon, what was the Information Commissioner's reaction to the legislation passed by the Tynwald? Did they feel their role was being undermined?
Yes, I saw that question. Very good question. The short answer is I don't know. I see the Information Commissioner about once every couple of weeks because his office is near mine, and he often walks past in the street and gives me a wave. But he's very jealous of his independence and doesn't chat much about the detail of the issues we both work on. I think the answer is no. I don't think, and I can't really remember now because it's getting back. I think we did have some kind of grudging message of acceptance in the sense that the Information Commissioner is a creature of statute. And, his whole premise of his intervention before we changed the legislation was founded on telling us we were misunderstanding the statutory framework that we had. And I think it follows that having changed the statutory framework, then the rules of the game have changed. So I don't think if he was around this table, would say his role has been undermined. But in truth, I don't know.
If he's still waving at you, that's perhaps a good sign.
That's as much as you get.
And Allison, Colleen's question for you is, what have been the strongest criticisms of the new procedures, and how have they been addressed?
The government certainly spoke. Standing Order 208 has been the one that's been most contested, the power of the committees to order the production of state documents, and that power is contested. And that's, from memory, that's the only one that the government really opposed when it was introduced in May 2019. So that one hasn't operated as intended, I suppose. There's also been some questions around equity in relation to debate, the 30-minute debate when all members want to talk. And I suppose the same in relation to the hard adjournment. Like, you can't, under the strict kind of application of the sessional orders, you can't just add a couple of minutes in at midnight, and you can't just add a couple of minutes in. And so the hard adjournment has been drafted in a way where it really is a hard adjournment. At midnight, we're going home. And so I think there has been some discussion about the impact of those time limits on members' ability to really contribute in the same way that they've done before, in that fulsome idea of debate. But I think members have definitely balanced that with there's far more opportunities to conduct business if we accept those limitations on the amount of time you give to any one particular item of business.
Thanks so much. Are there other questions for our panel? A late breaking question from me, Allison. purely selfishly thinking about my own work with the Standing Orders Committee here, with that short, sharp debate format you have where is it 30 minutes and you can squeeze in more topics than you ordinarily would on a normal private members day, do you put a question at the end of those, or is it, oh, you do? So it's not just a talk it out for 30 minutes and kick it down the road.
It's the normal debate, normal debate format with the motion before the House and the question that's put at the end. I think 8 of the 30 minutes go to the mover, either on, moving the question and reply, and the remainder are short contributions from other members during the 30 minutes. I think it's the one where members use leave quite a lot to either, not quite a lot, but yeah, if they can't get their speech into that time frame, they'll normally seek leave to extend their time for a minute, and there are provisions to add extra time to the 30 minutes debate should it be needed. And the House has taken that approach to managing debate because it's really become the default for all private members' items considered on a Wednesday. Unless it's a bill, it's considered within 30 minutes rather than the normal 2-hour debate that we've had. It's more of an opt-out of that 30-minute model rather than an opt-in, is the way that members are managing on the floor.
Sure, that's good to know. Thank you. And that takes us up to 3 o'clock. So on behalf of all the participants to this session 8, can I thank Jonathon and Allison so very much for sharing your time, particularly for you, Jonathon, being a particularly awful time of day. Thank you both so much for sharing your time and expertise with us, and you've given us a huge amount of food for thought. So thank you from all of us. And I now hand over to my colleague also down the hallway, Vaughan, for a wrap up. Over to you, Vaughan.
Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, even closer down the hall than Andrew. So first, thank you to Bridget and to Andrew Young and Warwick Gately for being moderators today. Really appreciate the time that you've put in, as well as, of course, all of our presenters. I'll offer just an, thought my video was on. Okay, I'll just offer a brief overview of some of the things that we've discussed today and then welcome you all back for tomorrow's session. So Damon Muller from the Parliament of Australia provided a really interesting overview of what components of the Australian electoral voting system are most affected by factors associated with the pandemic, with a particular focus on early voting, postal voting and phone voting, and how some jurisdictions have responded to the pandemic during elections. Professor John Phillimore and Assistant Professor Martin Drum presented their analysis of features of proportional representation and single transferable vote systems used in Australia, distinguishing 2 models for above the and below the line voting, and providing a really interesting analysis of the relationship between above the line voting and below the line voting under the different models, and what has occurred over time when various jurisdictions have changed their model of voting. The option of voting below the line is not exercised by a high proportion of voters under either of the models. And John and Martin also asked interesting questions about how voters use below the line voting to express inter-party and intra-party voting preferences. Speaker O'Day discussed the role and the risks of donations to political candidates and political parties, and discussed the merits and problems associated with models for public funding for political parties. He noted that many problems associated with political donations, including the actual and perceived effect of donations influencing candidate and political party decisions. Speaker O'Day advocated for an opt-out model public funding model, an opt-out public funding model for political campaigns, refined by effective public consultation and following guiding principles that it would be transparent, honourable, comprehensive, lawful, consistent and representative. Professor Colleen Lewis talked about the fundamental differences between authoritarian regimes and liberal democratic systems that ideally should be comprised of transparent and accountable executive and legislators. Drawing on a particular example, Colleen pointed towards what she regarded as alarming gaps between liberal democratic theory and practice regarding the proposed federal CIC. She questioned whether the distinction between law enforcement personnel and public servants under the proposed CIC was driven by evidence, and noted how the proposed CIC is significantly constrained in conducting investigations of substance into public servants. Colleen also suggested that compulsory education of elected representatives would help to maintain and strengthen our liberal democratic system. Jonathon King outlined how in the Isle of Man provisions have been made in data protection legislation to address the interaction between data protection and parliamentary privilege. He discussed issues arising in a case of requests for personal data from a parliamentary inquiry that was also apparently privileged to the committee and to the House. The House subsequently legislated to allow requests for information not to be supervised by the Information Commissioner with appropriate safeguards. Jonathon also described some of the considerations addressed due to the relationship of the Isle of Man with the UK and the EU. And finally, Allison Stowe discussed the significant number of new sessional orders that were adopted by the New South Wales Legislative Council during the 57th Parliament, with the objectives of attaining executive scrutiny, more opportunities for private members, and operational efficiencies. Allison also discussed the circumstances that prevailed in the decades prior to 2019 that led to the sessional orders being developed, as well as the non-government majority that provided the catalyst for their introduction. Allison outlined and analysed the effect of the sessional orders in relation to key areas of questions, committees, parliamentary secretaries, private members' business, and the schedule of business, and noted the substantial potential additional workload for the House as a result. And that's a wind-up of things that happened today. Thank you again for your participation, either as presenting, moderating, or just viewing and keeping an eye on what we've been up to at ASPG today. We look forward to seeing you all again. Same bat time, same bat channel at 11 a.m. See you all later. Thank you.